The year was 1532, and the morning sun cast long shadows across the stone terraces of Cusco when Spanish boots first echoed through the sacred halls of the Inca capital. What followed in the months and years after that conquest would become one of history's most systematic campaigns of violence against women, a horror so complete and devastating that chroniclers of the time struggled to find words adequate to describe what they witnessed. Today we're going to examine the untold story of what Spanish conquistadors did to Inca women during the conquest and colonization of Peru. This isn't just another tale of military conquest or political upheaval. This is the story of how an entire civilization's women became targets of a coordinated campaign of sexual violence, forced labor, and cultural destruction that would reshape the Andes for centuries to come. If you're interested in these dark chapters of history that textbooks often gloss over, make sure to hit that subscribe button and leave a comment about where you're watching from. I'm genuinely curious to know how far these forgotten stories reach around the world. The reality of what happened to Inca women goes far beyond anything Hollywood has ever portrayed. We're not talking about isolated incidents or the unfortunate byproducts of war. We're talking about systematic, institutionalized violence that was built into the very foundation of Spanish colonial rule. The evidence comes from multiple sources that paint a horrifying picture when assembled together. Archaeological excavations, legal documents, missionary reports, and the testimony of survivors themselves all point to the same devastating conclusion. But before we dive into the darkest aspects of this story, we need to understand what life was like for women in Inca society before the Spanish arrived. The Inca Empire, known as Tawantinsuyu, had complex social structures that included specific roles and protections for women. Elite women held positions of religious authority and political influence. The Asialas, or chosen women, were selected for their beauty and skill to serve in temples and royal households. These women enjoyed high status and protection under Inca law. Ordinary women in Inca society also had defined roles and rights. They participated in agricultural work, textile production, and household management. While Inca society wasn't egalitarian by modern standards, women had legal protections, property rights, and social networks that provided security and support. Marriage was regulated by community customs, and sexual violence was punishable under Inca law. All of this changed overnight when Francisco Pizarro and his men captured the Inca Emperor Atahualpa in November 1532. What followed wasn't just military conquest, but the complete dismantling of social structures that had protected women for generations. The first wave of violence began immediately after the Spanish seized control of major Inca cities. Contemporary chronicles describe scenes that would shock even hardened observers today. Spanish soldiers forced their way into noble households and seized women of all ages. The reed partitions that provided privacy in Inca homes were torn down. Women were dragged from their families and forced into the quarters of Spanish soldiers and colonists. These weren't random acts of violence by undisciplined troops. This was systematic appropriation of women as spoils of war, sanctioned and organized by Spanish commanders. The Spanish viewed indigenous women as resources to be distributed along with gold, silver, and land. Legal documents from the period show that women were literally assigned to Spanish colonists as part of their reward grants. Archaeological evidence supports these written accounts in disturbing detail. Excavations of early colonial settlements show sudden changes in household layouts and personal artifacts that indicate the forced integration of Spanish men and indigenous women. Sites that had been organized according to traditional Inca family structures show evidence of disruption and reorganization under Spanish control. The human cost becomes even more apparent when we examine skeletal remains from this period. Bioarchaeologists studying cemeteries near early Spanish settlements have found increased evidence of trauma and stress markers in female skeletons. These include signs of malnutrition, infectious disease, and physical violence that weren't present in pre-conquest populations. But the physical violence was just one aspect of a much larger system of oppression. The Spanish colonial administration created legal frameworks that institutionalized the exploitation of indigenous women. The encomienda system, which granted Spanish colonists the right to extract tribute and labor from indigenous communities, specifically included provisions about access to women. Encomenderos, the Spanish recipients of these grants, viewed indigenous women as part of their entitlement. They could demand domestic service, textile production, and sexual access as part of their colonial privileges. Legal documents from Spanish archives show that women were routinely transferred between Spanish households like property. The impact on indigenous families was catastrophic. Traditional kinship networks that had protected women were shattered. Men who might have defended their wives, daughters, and sisters were killed in battle, forced into labor gangs, or relocated to distant work sites. Women found themselves isolated and vulnerable in ways that would have been unthinkable under the old system. The Spanish Catholic Church, which arrived alongside the Conquistadors, added another layer of complexity to this tragedy. While some missionaries genuinely attempted to protect indigenous women from abuse, the Church also became complicit in the system of exploitation. Baptismal records from the period show a dramatic spike in mixed ancestry children, clear evidence of the scale of sexual violence taking place. Church officials found themselves in an impossible position. Canon law prohibited rape and concubinage, but Spanish colonial society was built on these practices. Some priests tried to force Spanish men to marry indigenous women who had borne their children, but these efforts were largely unsuccessful. The result was thousands of women left to raise children alone without legal protection or economic support. The testimony of Spanish chroniclers provides some of the most damning evidence of systematic abuse. Bartolomé de las Casas, a Dominican friar who witnessed the conquest firsthand, documented case after case of sexual violence against indigenous women. His accounts describe a culture of impunity where Spanish colonists could assault women without fear of punishment. Las Casas wrote about Spanish soldiers who would compete to see who could commit the most horrific acts of violence. He documented cases where pregnant women were killed and their unborn children torn from their wombs. He described Spanish colonists who would force indigenous women to watch the execution of their husbands and children before assaulting them. These weren't the actions of a few rogue individuals. This was the norm across Spanish colonial territories. Administrative correspondence between colonial officials shows that sexual violence against indigenous women was so common that it barely merited comment in official reports. The legal system that emerged in colonial Peru reflected these attitudes. Spanish law recognized different categories of people with different rights and protections. Indigenous women occupied the lowest rung of this hierarchy, with virtually no legal recourse against abuse by Spanish men. Court records from the period show that indigenous women did sometimes attempt to seek justice through the colonial legal system. They filed petitions seeking child support from Spanish fathers, protection from abusive employers, or recognition of informal marriages. But these cases were almost always decided in favor of Spanish defendants. The few women who did manage to win legal victories faced enormous obstacles. They had to navigate a system conducted in a foreign language, with procedures they didn't understand, while lacking the economic resources to hire competent representation. Even when they won, enforcement was virtually impossible. The economic incentives of the colonial system ensured that exploitation would continue regardless of legal protections on paper. Spanish colonists depended on indigenous labor for their wealth and status. Women's domestic work, textile production, and reproductive capacity were all seen as economic resources to be maximized. Archaeological evidence shows how this economic exploitation transformed indigenous communities. Excavations of colonial period settlements reveal changes in household organization that reflect the integration of indigenous women into Spanish-controlled production systems. Traditional craft specializations were redirected to serve Spanish markets rather than community needs. The demographic impact of this systematic violence was staggering. Disease epidemics that accompanied Spanish colonization hit indigenous populations with devastating force, but women faced additional vulnerabilities. Malnutrition from increased labor demands, trauma from sexual violence, and disruption of traditional childcare practices all contributed to declining birth rates and increased mortality. Population records from the late 16th century show dramatic declines in indigenous populations, with women and children bearing a disproportionate share of the losses. Some regions lost more than 90% of their pre-conquest population within a generation of Spanish arrival. The Spanish colonial administration was well aware of these demographic trends, but viewed them primarily as economic problems rather than humanitarian crises. Officials worried about maintaining adequate labor supplies for mines and plantations, not about the human cost of their policies. This systematic destruction of indigenous women's lives and communities represents one of history's most comprehensive campaigns of gender-based violence. It was violence sanctioned by law, justified by religion, and motivated by economic gain. The perpetrators faced no consequences, while the victims had no recourse. What makes this tragedy even more horrific is how thoroughly it was documented by the perpetrators themselves. Spanish colonial officials kept meticulous records of their activities, creating an archive of systematic abuse that historians can trace in excruciating detail. As we'll explore in the next part of this series, the patterns established during the conquest period would persist for centuries, creating institutional structures of oppression that affected generations of indigenous women. The immediate violence of the conquest was just the beginning of a much longer campaign of cultural destruction and exploitation. The transformation of indigenous women from protected members of their communities into commodities in a colonial economy was facilitated by Spanish legal innovations that would horrify modern observers. The repartimiento system, which replaced the encomienda in many regions, created new mechanisms for distributing indigenous labor that specifically targeted women for domestic and sexual exploitation. Under this system, Spanish officials would literally allocate women to colonial households like livestock. Notarial records from Lima and Cusco contain inventories that list indigenous women alongside cattle, furniture, and agricultural tools. These documents reveal the bureaucratic machinery that reduced human beings to line items in administrative ledgers. The allocation process itself was designed to maximize Spanish control while minimizing indigenous resistance. Women were typically separated from their families and assigned to Spanish households in different regions, making it impossible for traditional kinship networks to provide protection or support. This geographic dispersal was intentional policy, not accidental consequence. Spanish colonial law created a legal fiction that indigenous women were willing participants in these arrangements. Official documents describe forced concubinage as voluntary relationships between Spanish men and indigenous women seeking economic security. This legal language provided cover for systematic sexual slavery, while creating bureaucratic barriers for women seeking redress. The reality behind this legal facade becomes clear when examining the testimony of indigenous women who managed to navigate the colonial court system. Their petitions describe being seized from their homes, transported against their will to Spanish settlements, and forced into sexual servitude under threat of violence. Many described watching their children being taken away as punishment for resistance. Medical records from colonial hospitals provide another horrifying window into the treatment of indigenous women. Physicians' notes describe treating women for injuries consistent with sexual assault, malnutrition from inadequate food provisions, and complications from pregnancies resulting from rape. These medical documents were kept primarily to track costs rather than provide care. The hospital records also reveal the Spanish colonial administration's approach to indigenous women's health as an economic calculation. Women who became too ill or injured to work were often abandoned without treatment. Those who recovered were typically returned to the same conditions that had caused their injuries in the first place. Archaeological excavations of colonial period cemeteries provide disturbing corroboration of these medical accounts. Skeletal analyses reveal patterns of trauma and disease that tell the story of systematic abuse, with scientific precision. Pelvic fractures, healed bone breaks from beatings, and evidence of chronic infections paint a picture of sustained violence. The isotopic analysis of teeth and bones from these cemetery excavations reveals another dimension of suffering. Chemical signatures in skeletal remains show dramatic dietary changes that indicate forced relocation and inadequate nutrition. Women who had grown up eating traditional Andean foods show evidence of being forced onto Spanish colonial diets that lacked essential nutrients. These scientific findings align perfectly with documentary evidence about the disruption of traditional food systems. Spanish colonists appropriated the most productive agricultural lands for their own use, while forcing indigenous communities onto marginal terrain. Women who had traditionally managed household food security found themselves unable to feed their families adequately. The Spanish colonial administration compounded this nutritional crisis by imposing tribute requirements that specifically targeted women's production. Indigenous communities were required to provide textiles, food, and other goods produced primarily by women. These tribute demands often exceeded what communities could reasonably provide while maintaining subsistence levels. The enforcement of tribute collection created additional opportunities for abuse. Spanish officials would arrive in indigenous communities with armed escorts to collect required goods. When communities couldn't meet their quotas, officials would seize women as collateral or punishment. These seizures were documented in official records as legitimate debt collection. The psychological impact of this systematic violence extended far beyond individual victims. Indigenous communities developed collective trauma responses that affected social structures for generations. Traditional ceremonies and cultural practices associated with women's roles were suppressed or driven underground to avoid Spanish attention. The Spanish colonial church played a complex role in both perpetuating and occasionally challenging this system of abuse. While some individual missionaries genuinely tried to protect indigenous women, the institutional church was deeply complicit in colonial exploitation. Church records show that ecclesiastical officials often owned indigenous women as domestic servants. Baptismal records from colonial parishes reveal the scale of sexual violence through the dramatic increase in mixed ancestry children. These records typically identified mothers while leaving fathers unnamed or described only as Spanish. This pattern protected Spanish men from legal responsibility while stigmatizing indigenous women as immoral. Marriage records from the same period show how the church attempted to manage the social consequences of widespread rape and concubinage. Spanish colonial law required ecclesiastical permission for marriages, giving priests significant power over indigenous women's lives. Many women found themselves trapped in abusive relationships because the church refused to grant permission for separation. The economic incentives driving this system of exploitation were embedded in every aspect of colonial society. Spanish colonists depended on indigenous women's unpaid labor for basic domestic needs like cooking, cleaning, textile production, and childcare. This labor was considered a natural entitlement rather than work-deserving compensation. Household inventories from Spanish colonial estates provide detailed documentation of how indigenous women's labor was organized and exploited. These documents list women by name, alongside descriptions of their skills and work assignments. Women were valued based on their productivity in specific tasks, rather than recognized as human beings with rights. The Spanish colonial administration created bureaucratic mechanisms to ensure steady supplies of indigenous women for colonial households. Regional officials maintained registries of available women and coordinated transfers between different Spanish settlements. These registries treated women like any other resource that needed to be allocated efficiently. The resistance strategies that indigenous women developed in response to this systematic oppression required extraordinary courage and creativity. Legal petitions surviving in colonial archives show women attempting to use Spanish law against their oppressors, despite facing enormous barriers to accessing the court system. Some women managed to establish informal networks that provided mutual support and protection. Archaeological evidence from colonial settlements shows discrete gathering spaces and hidden storage areas that may have been used for clandestine meetings. These material traces suggest organized resistance activities that left no written record. The Spanish colonial administration was acutely aware of the potential for indigenous resistance and developed sophisticated surveillance systems to monitor women's activities. Household servants were encouraged to report on each other's behavior. Spanish officials conducted periodic inspections of indigenous neighborhoods to identify potential troublemakers. The punishment for resistance was swift and brutal. Colonial records document public executions of women accused of organizing resistance activities. These executions were deliberately staged as spectacles to intimidate other potential resistors. The victims were often tortured before being killed to maximize the psychological impact on observers. The legal framework supporting this system of oppression was remarkably comprehensive and detailed. Spanish colonial law specified different punishments for indigenous women who committed various offenses against Spanish authority. Running away from assigned work carried different penalties than refusing sexual advances or attempting to contact family members. These legal codes reveal the Spanish colonial administration's understanding that indigenous women posed a significant threat to colonial stability if they were allowed to organize or maintain traditional social connections. The elaborate legal apparatus for controlling women's behavior demonstrates both the scope of Spanish fears and the extent of indigenous resistance. The demographic consequences of this systematic violence become clear when examining population records from the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Colonial censuses show dramatic declines in indigenous populations, with adult women experiencing particularly severe mortality rates. These demographic patterns reflect both direct violence and the collapse of traditional social structures that had supported women's health and survival. The long-term cultural impact extended far beyond population statistics. Traditional knowledge systems maintained by women were disrupted or lost entirely. Practices related to agriculture, medicine, textile production, and spiritual life that had been passed down through generations of women were severed by the violence of colonial rule. Spanish colonial officials recognized the strategic importance of destroying these cultural transmission systems. Administrative correspondence between colonial administrators explicitly discusses the need to separate indigenous children from their mothers to prevent the continuation of traditional practices. This cultural destruction was policy, not accident. The archives contain heartbreaking testimony from indigenous women describing their attempts to maintain cultural practices in secret. Some hid traditional textiles and ceremonial objects from Spanish authorities. Others taught children traditional songs and stories during brief moments when they were not under direct surveillance. But the systematic nature of colonial oppression made cultural resistance increasingly difficult over time. As traditional social networks were destroyed and women were dispersed across different Spanish households, the mechanisms for cultural transmission were severely compromised. Much knowledge was lost forever. The evidence for this cultural destruction extends beyond written documents to material remains. Archaeological excavations show the disappearance of traditional craft techniques and ceremonial objects from indigenous settlements. The material culture that had defined Andean women's roles and identities was systematically replaced with Spanish colonial alternatives. This wasn't simply cultural change or adaptation, as some colonial apologists have claimed. This was deliberate cultural destruction carried out through violence and coercion. The Spanish colonial administration understood that maintaining indigenous cultural practices would undermine colonial authority, and therefore worked systematically to eliminate them. The scale and systematic nature of violence against indigenous women during the Spanish conquest and colonization of Peru represents one of history's most comprehensive campaigns of gender-based oppression. It was violence sanctioned by law, blessed by religion, and motivated by economic greed. The perpetrators documented their crimes in meticulous detail while ensuring their victims had no voice in the historical record. As we continue to uncover the full extent of this tragedy through archaeological research and archival investigation, the moral imperative becomes clear. These weren't isolated incidents or unfortunate byproducts of conquest. This was systematic, intentional violence that destroyed lives, families, and entire cultural systems. The next phase of our investigation will examine how these patterns of violence became institutionalized in colonial law and society, creating structures of oppression that would persist for centuries beyond the initial conquest period. The institutionalization of these horrific practices reached its most systematic form through the establishment of colonial legal codes that would govern Spanish territories for the next 3 centuries. By the 1550s, the Spanish crown had developed comprehensive regulations that codified the exploitation of indigenous women into formal law, creating bureaucratic machinery designed to extract maximum value from human suffering. The new laws of 1542 represented the Spanish crown's first major attempt to regulate colonial behavior toward indigenous peoples. On paper, these laws contained protections for indigenous women and children, requiring colonists to treat them with basic human dignity. The reality on the ground told a vastly different story. Colonial administrators and encomenderos simply ignored provisions they found inconvenient while exploiting loopholes that rendered protections meaningless. Local implementation of these laws varied dramatically depending on the interests of Spanish officials and colonists. In regions where gold and silver mining dominated the economy, indigenous women were routinely forced into support roles that included cooking, cleaning, and providing sexual services to miners. In agricultural areas, they were integrated into plantation systems as unpaid domestic workers and field laborers. The gap between legal theory and colonial practice created a culture of systematic deception that permeated every level of Spanish administration. Official reports sent back to Spain described peaceful conversion of indigenous peoples to Christianity and their grateful acceptance of Spanish civilization. The reality documented in private correspondence and local records painted a picture of sustained resistance met with brutal suppression. Archaeological evidence from mining settlements provides particularly disturbing insights into the treatment of indigenous women in these extractive economies. Excavations at sites like Potosí reveal living quarters designed to house large numbers of women in conditions resembling prison barracks more than family homes. The material remains include restraining devices, medical instruments for treating injuries, and burial grounds with unusually high concentrations of female skeletons showing signs of violent death. The Spanish colonial administration developed sophisticated systems for tracking and managing indigenous women as economic assets. Registry books surviving in colonial archives contain detailed inventories of women's skills, ages, and work assignments. These ledgers treated human beings like livestock, recording births, deaths, and transfers between Spanish owners with clinical precision. Regional administrators coordinated the distribution of indigenous women across Spanish settlements to ensure adequate labor supplies for different economic activities. Women with specialized skills in textile production were allocated to areas with cloth manufacturing operations. Those with agricultural knowledge were assigned to plantation regions. Young women without specific skills were typically directed to domestic service in Spanish households. The bureaucratic machinery supporting this system required extensive record keeping that has left historians with unprecedented documentation of systematic human trafficking. Transport manifests detail the movement of indigenous women between colonies. Payment records show Spanish officials receiving compensation for facilitating these transfers. Insurance documents reveal that indigenous women were valued as property that could be bought, sold, and protected against loss. The Spanish colonial church played an increasingly complex role in legitimizing this system of exploitation through theological justifications that portrayed indigenous women as naturally subordinate to Spanish men. Ecclesiastical writings from the period argued that God had ordained racial hierarchies that placed Spanish Christians above indigenous peoples in the natural order of creation. These theological arguments provided moral cover for practices that violated basic Christian teachings about human dignity and sexual morality. Colonial priests developed elaborate casuistical arguments explaining why forced concubinage didn't constitute rape, and why seizing women from their families didn't violate commandments against theft and adultery. The Church's complicity extended beyond mere theological justification to active participation in the exploitation of Indigenous women. Ecclesiastical records show that religious institutions owned significant numbers of Indigenous women as domestic servants and agricultural workers. Convents and monasteries operated workshops staffed by unpaid Indigenous women who produced goods for sale in colonial markets. Baptismal and marriage records reveal how the Church attempted to manage the social consequences of widespread sexual violence, while maintaining the fiction that Spanish colonial society operated according to Christian moral principles. Priests developed bureaucratic procedures for legitimizing mixed ancestry children and formalizing relationships between Spanish men and Indigenous women that had begun with rape. The psychological warfare employed against Indigenous women extended far beyond physical violence to include deliberate strategies designed to destroy their sense of identity and agency. Spanish colonists understood that maintaining Indigenous cultural connections posed a threat to colonial control, and therefore worked systematically to sever these bonds. Women were typically assigned Spanish names upon baptism, erasing their Indigenous identities from official records. They were forbidden from speaking native languages in Spanish households and punished severely for practicing traditional customs or maintaining contact with Indigenous communities. These policies created psychological isolation that made resistance more difficult while facilitating cultural assimilation. The intergenerational impact of this cultural destruction becomes evident when examining the experiences of mixed ancestry children born from sexual violence. These children occupied ambiguous positions in colonial society, neither fully Spanish nor Indigenous, often rejected by both communities while remaining vulnerable to exploitation by Spanish colonists seeking cheap labor. Colonial legal codes developed elaborate classification systems for mixed ancestry individuals that determine their rights, obligations, and social status. Children with Spanish fathers might gain some protection if their paternity was officially recognized, but most were abandoned to grow up in Indigenous communities that struggled to provide adequate care while dealing with their own survival challenges. The economic incentives driving this system of exploitation grew more sophisticated over time as Spanish colonists developed new ways to profit from Indigenous women's labor and reproductive capacity. Textile workshops operated by Spanish entrepreneurs relied almost entirely on unpaid Indigenous women who worked under conditions resembling industrial slavery. These workshops produced goods for both local colonial markets and export to Spain, generating substantial profits that enriched Spanish colonists while providing no compensation to the Indigenous women whose labor created this wealth. Production quotas were enforced through physical punishment and threats of family separation. The Spanish colonial administration developed taxation systems that specifically targeted Indigenous women's productive activities. Communities were required to provide tribute payments that included textiles, food products, and other goods produced primarily by women. These tribute requirements often exceeded what communities could reasonably provide while maintaining subsistence levels. The enforcement of tribute collection created systematic opportunities for abuse as Spanish officials would seize women and children as collateral when communities couldn't meet their quotas. These seizures were documented in official records as legitimate debt collection procedures, providing legal cover for what amounted to human trafficking operations. Regional variations in colonial policy created different patterns of exploitation that reflected local economic priorities and demographic conditions. In coastal areas where Spanish settlement was more concentrated, Indigenous women were more likely to be integrated into urban household service. In highland regions with scattered Spanish presence, they faced forced relocation to mining centers or administrative towns. The transportation of Indigenous women across long distances for work assignments created additional opportunities for abuse and exploitation. Travel records document sexual assaults during transport, abandonment of sick or injured women along travel routes, and the use of forced marches as punishment for resistance activities. Spanish colonial military culture contributed significantly to the normalization of sexual violence against indigenous women. Garrison records and military correspondence reveal a culture where assault and rape were considered normal privileges of military service rather than criminal acts deserving punishment. Military commanders distributed indigenous women to soldiers as rewards for service or as incentives for participation in particularly dangerous missions. These distributions were documented in official records using a language that treated women like military supplies rather than human beings with rights and dignity. The legal system that emerged to manage colonial society reflected these military attitudes toward indigenous women. Colonial courts operated under the assumption that Spanish men had natural authority over indigenous women that included sexual access. Legal proceedings rarely questioned the testimony of Spanish defendants, while treating indigenous women's complaints with skepticism. Court records from major colonial cities reveal patterns of systematic bias that made legal remedies virtually impossible for indigenous women seeking justice. Cases involving sexual assault were routinely dismissed or decided in favor of Spanish defendants. Even when indigenous women won legal victories, enforcement mechanisms were so weak that practical relief was rarely achieved. The few indigenous women who managed to navigate the colonial legal system successfully often faced retaliation from Spanish colonists, who viewed legal challenges as threats to the established social order. Successful petitioners might find themselves reassigned to more abusive work situations or targeted for criminal prosecution on fabricated charges. This legal retaliation created powerful incentives for indigenous women to accept exploitation silently rather than risk making their situations worse through formal complaints. The Spanish colonial administration understood these dynamics and deliberately structured legal procedures to discourage indigenous resistance, while maintaining the appearance of judicial fairness. The demographic consequences of systematic sexual violence became increasingly severe as colonial policies disrupted traditional family formation and childcare practices. Indigenous communities experienced declining birth rates, increased infant mortality, and social disruption that affected their ability to maintain population levels. Spanish colonial censuses from the late 16th century document population declines exceeding 90% in some regions, with adult women experiencing particularly severe mortality rates. These demographic catastrophes reflected both direct violence and the collapse of social support systems that had traditionally protected women's health and survival. The Spanish colonial administration tracked these population trends primarily as economic indicators rather than humanitarian concerns. Officials worried about maintaining adequate labor supplies for colonial enterprises, but showed little interest in addressing the underlying causes of demographic collapse. Colonial correspondence reveals administrators discussing indigenous women as breeding stock, whose reproductive capacity needed to be managed to ensure future labor supplies. These discussions employed dehumanizing language that reduced women to their biological functions while ignoring their suffering and resistance. The resistance strategies that indigenous women developed in response to this systematic oppression required extraordinary courage and creativity under conditions of constant surveillance and severe punishment for any signs of defiance. Some women managed to maintain secret networks that provided mutual support and coordinated resistance activities. Archaeological evidence suggests that indigenous women developed sophisticated methods for concealing traditional cultural practices and maintaining connections with their communities despite Spanish efforts at cultural destruction. Hidden storage areas, discrete gathering spaces, and coded symbols in textile production all point to organized resistance that left few traces in official records. The Spanish colonial administration was acutely aware of the potential for indigenous resistance and invested considerable resources in surveillance systems designed to monitor women's activities and prevent the formation of resistance networks. Household servants were encouraged to inform on each other's behavior, and Spanish officials conducted regular inspections of indigenous neighborhoods. The punishment for discovered resistance was swift and brutal, designed to terrorize other potential resistors into submission. Public executions of women accused of organizing resistance activities were staged as elaborate spectacles intended to demonstrate Spanish power while destroying indigenous morale. Despite these risks, indigenous women continued to resist colonial oppression through both individual acts of defiance and collective organizing efforts. Legal petitions, escape attempts, work slowdowns, and cultural preservation activities all represented forms of resistance that challenged Spanish authority, even under conditions of extreme repression. The long-term consequences of this systematic violence extended far beyond the colonial period itself, creating social and economic structures that would persist for centuries. The patterns of exploitation established during the conquest became embedded in legal codes, social customs, and economic relationships that survived political independence and continued to affect indigenous women's lives well into the modern era. Understanding the full scope of what Spanish conquistadors did to Inca women requires recognizing that this wasn't simply historical tragedy, but the foundation of colonial systems that continue to influence social relationships in Latin America today. The violence was systematic, institutionalized, and designed to create permanent structures of dominance that would serve Spanish interests for generations. The evidence assembled from archaeological excavations, archival research, and bioarchaeological analysis creates an overwhelming case that sexual violence against indigenous women was central to Spanish colonial policy rather than an unfortunate byproduct of conquest. This violence served specific economic, political, and cultural functions that were essential to maintaining Spanish control over indigenous populations. As we prepare to examine the final phase of this investigation, we'll explore how the legacy of colonial violence against women shaped the development of Latin American societies and continues to influence contemporary discussions about justice, memory, and reparations for historical wrongs, orangs. The documentation of these atrocities becomes even more chilling when we examine the bureaucratic precision with which Spanish colonial administrators recorded their crimes. They weren't trying to hide what they were doing. They were proud of it. They saw it as efficient administration of conquered territory. Administrative ledgers from the colonial archives reveal a system so thoroughly organized that it resembled a modern corporation more than a military occupation. Spanish officials maintained detailed inventories of indigenous women, categorizing them by age, skills, and physical appearance. These human beings were literally numbered and catalogued, like merchandise in a warehouse. The record keeping was exhaustive. Birth certificates for mixed ancestry children, death certificates for women who died under Spanish control, transfer documents when women were moved between households or regions, insurance policies protecting Spanish colonists against the loss of their human property. The bureaucracy of exploitation was staggering in its scope and precision. What makes these documents particularly disturbing is the casual tone in which they discuss human trafficking and sexual slavery. Colonial administrators wrote about the distribution of indigenous women with the same matter-of-fact language they used to discuss livestock or agricultural equipment. There was no sense that they were documenting crimes. In their minds, they were simply managing resources. The Spanish Crown's response to reports of abuse reveals the true priorities of colonial policy. When missionary complaints about the treatment of indigenous women reached Madrid, royal officials expressed concern primarily about potential threats to colonial stability, rather than moral outrage about systematic rape and exploitation. Royal correspondence from the period shows administrators calculating the economic costs of indigenous resistance against the profits generated by exploiting indigenous women. Their concern wasn't ethical, It was financial. They wanted to maximize extraction while minimizing disruption to colonial operations. This cost-benefit analysis led to policy adjustments designed to make exploitation more sustainable rather than more humane. Spanish officials developed new legal frameworks that provided minimal protections for indigenous women while preserving the essential structures of colonial domination. The judicial procedures established to handle complaints about abuse were deliberately designed to discourage indigenous women from seeking legal remedies. Court proceedings were conducted in Spanish, using legal terminology that indigenous women couldn't understand. Testimony from Spanish defendants was automatically given more weight than testimony from indigenous plaintiffs. Even when indigenous women managed to navigate these procedural obstacles and win legal victories, enforcement mechanisms were so weak that practical relief was rarely achieved. Spanish colonists understood that they could ignore court orders with impunity because colonial administrators prioritized social stability over legal justice. The few cases where Spanish men were actually punished for abusing indigenous women typically involved violations of Spanish honor codes rather than concerns about indigenous rights. A Spanish man might face sanctions for stealing another Spaniard's indigenous concubine, but rarely for the abuse itself. This selective enforcement created a legal system that protected Spanish interests while providing the appearance of justice. Colonial administrators could point to occasional prosecutions as evidence that the system worked fairly while ignoring the thousands of cases where abuse went unpunished. The psychological impact of this systematic violence extended far beyond individual victims to entire communities. Indigenous societies that had maintained complex social structures for centuries found themselves unable to protect their most vulnerable members. The breakdown of traditional protective mechanisms created collective trauma that affected multiple generations. Elderly women who had held positions of respect and authority in traditional Inca society found themselves powerless to protect their daughters and granddaughters from Spanish exploitation. Traditional ceremonies that celebrated women's roles in agriculture, textile production, and spiritual life were suppressed or driven underground. The horror we've uncovered today represents more than historical tragedy. It reveals the calculated destruction of an entire civilization's women through systematic violence, legal exploitation, and cultural annihilation. These weren't accidents of war, but deliberate policies designed to break indigenous resistance by targeting those who held families and communities together. The skeletal remains, legal documents, and missionary testimonies all converge on the same devastating truth. Spanish conquistadors didn't just conquer territory, they weaponized sexual violence to destroy the social fabric of Inca society. The women who once held positions of honor as priestesses, artisans, and community leaders were reduced to numbered entries in Spanish inventory ledgers. What makes this story even more disturbing is how thoroughly it was documented by the perpetrators themselves, who saw nothing wrong with their actions. They created an archive of systematic abuse so detailed that we can trace individual women through years of exploitation across multiple Spanish households. The legacy of this violence didn't end with the colonial period. The structures of oppression established by Spanish conquistadors became embedded in legal codes and social systems that persisted for centuries, creating patterns of inequality that continue to affect indigenous communities today. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard. Their suffering demands acknowledgement, and their resistance, maintained even under impossible conditions, stands as testimony to human dignity that no amount of violence could completely destroy. We owe it to their memory to remember not just how they died, but how courageously they lived.